There is a particular quality of stillness that belongs to a room where someone works alone with their hands, slowly, unhurried by the noise of the world outside. You may have felt it yourself, seated at a table in the early morning before the house has stirred, the light still soft and low at the window, and something in front of you that requires only patience and care. The sounds that exist in that kind of room are not silence so much as layers of quiet pressed against each other. The faint movement of a breath, the settling of a timber, the distant call of a bird that seems, in that moment, to have been placed there precisely, so the stillness has something to lean against. Time moves differently in such rooms. It does not hurry. It gathers itself slowly, the way dew gathers on a stone, the way ink gathers in the shallow well of a grinding stone, pooling, darkening, deepening until it is ready. Tonight, we are going to that kind of stillness. We are going to sit beside a low writing table in a city that no longer exists as it once was, in a room where the lamplight is warm and amber and falls across a polished stone, an inkstone, smooth and dark, and faintly cool to the touch, while the city of Heian-kyo lies gathered around its rivers and hills in the long quiet of a night more than 1,000 years ago. This is Kyoto as it was in its first and most dreamlike age, a city of wide avenues and wooden pavilions, of gardens still fragrant from the afternoon, of courtiers in layered silk listening to music drifting across lamplight water. We are going to move through that world slowly, the way water moves through a garden, finding the low places and the quiet corners, resting in the beauty of daily things. Let the sounds around you now begin to soften. Let the room you are in settle a little into the dark. We have all the time there is. The city of Heian-kyo came into being in the year 794, when Emperor Kanmu ordered his court relocated from the ancient capital of Nara to a broad, river-threaded plain in central Japan, flanked on three sides by forested mountains that rose in gradual ridges toward the sky. The name chosen for the new capital was both a wish and a description: Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. The city was laid out in an enormous grid of perfectly measured avenues, modeled on the great Tang capital of Chang'an in China, with the imperial palace at the northern center like the pivot of a compass, and all roads and districts arranged southward in careful symmetry. The avenues were wide enough for ceremonial processions, their packed earth surfaces lined in some places with willow trees, and in others with the wooden walls of aristocratic estates, behind which the rooftops of cypress bark pavilions curved in gentle arcs against the sky. In the early decades of Heian-kyo's existence, the sound of hammers and saws would have been constant, the whole plain busy with builders carrying timbers, thatchers spreading the long strips of hinoki cypress bark across the curving rooftops, craftsmen lifting lacquered columns into place while the city took its permanent form around them. The rivers that ran through and around the capital, the Kanmu to the east and the Katsura to the west, provided fresh water and the possibility of small boat journeys, and the mountains in every direction gave the city a sense of being held, of being sheltered by something older and larger than itself. The geomancers who chose the site found it favorable on all counts. The north and east and west were sheltered by mountain ridges. The south lay open to the sky. The city's position in the landscape was understood as a form of balance, the same balance sought in every garden and every poem written within its boundaries for the next 4 centuries. As the decades passed and the city settled into itself, the culture that grew inside it began to drift away from the Chinese models it had initially borrowed and toward something genuinely its own, something more fluid, more attuned to season and shadow, and the soft pressure of feeling that has no easy name. Japan had suspended its formal missions to Tang, China in 894, partly because of political unrest on the continent, and this withdrawal from direct Chinese influence turned out to be one of the most generative decisions the court ever made. Free from the pressure to constantly refer back to an external model, Japanese culture began to listen more carefully to itself, to its own landscape, its own sounds, its own way of understanding beauty. The result, over the following 2 centuries, was a flowering so complete and so distinctive that later scholars would look back at the Middle Heian period as a golden age that had never quite been surpassed. A moment when everything that made Japanese culture recognizably itself came into bloom at once, as completely as the cherry trees that the court watched so carefully each spring. The nobles of the Heian court were known as the Kyuge, and they inhabited sprawling wooden estates built in a style called Shinden-zukuri, which means, loosely, sleeping hall architecture. Their homes were clusters of single-story halls connected by open covered walkways, with roofs of layered hinoki cypress bark that curved slightly at the eaves and gave the whole structure a quality of resting lightly on the ground. The screens and blinds rather than solid walls meant that the line between interior and garden was never quite fixed. On a warm evening, when the wooden screens were raised and the lamplight spilled across the polished floor and out onto the raked gravel of the courtyard, you might have stood at the edge of the corridor and felt genuinely uncertain whether you were inside the house or part of the garden. That uncertainty was not a failure of design, but very nearly its point. The main hall, the Shinden, faced south toward the garden and the pond. To the east and west, subsidiary halls called Tainoya were linked to it by corridors, and at the ends of the southernmost corridors, fishing pavilions called suridon extended out over the edges of the pond, so that a person sitting at the far end of the pavilion would have been surrounded on 3 sides by water, with the garden and the main hall behind them and the open southern sky ahead. The estate of a high-ranking aristocrat typically occupied a square plot of about 120 meters on each side, and within that space, every element had its considered purpose. The courtyard between the main hall and the pond might be covered in white sand raked smooth, against which the dark water of the pond and the green of the garden plantings appeared with particular clarity, the way silence makes a single sound more audible. Inside the Shinden-zukuri halls, daily life was lived very close to the floor. There were no chairs. People sat, worked, and slept on layers of woven rush mats, and the furniture of daily life, writing boxes, lamp stands, low tables, portable partitions made of silk and lacquered wood called kyoto, was arranged around the person rather than the person moving to occupy fixed positions. These silk partitions were moved according to need and season, the whole interior of the house being in some sense constantly rearranging itself, adapting to weather and occasion. This flexibility was not merely practical. It expressed a deep preference for the provisional over the permanent, for spaces that breathed and changed rather than spaces that fixed and constrained. The same aesthetic preference that produced these movable interiors also produced the Waka poem with its 5 brief lines, rather than the long formal ode. the diary entry that notices the quality of a morning's light, rather than the monumental chronicle that records only what was decided and by whom. At the center of all aristocratic life in Heian-kyo was the practice of calligraphy, and at the center of calligraphy was the inkstone, a small, weighty object of polished stone called the suzuri. The inkstone was not merely a tool. It was, in the understanding of the time, the beginning of everything that writing could mean. The four instruments used for writing, the brush, the ink stick, the inkstone, and the paper, were collectively called the four treasures of the study, bunbo shiho, a phrase borrowed from China but made entirely Japanese in its emotional weight. The inkstone was carved from fine-grained stone, smooth on its grinding surface and slightly hollow at one end to hold the prepared ink, and its quality was a matter of great and continuing importance. Good stones were discussed, compared, admired, and passed down through families, because an inkstone of fine grain would yield ink of the right texture and depth. And ink of the right texture and depth was the first condition of beautiful writing, and beautiful writing was, in the Heian court, one of the primary measures of a person's inner worth. The preparation of ink was itself a form of practice, a daily ritual that preceded all writing and established its quality of attention. A courtier, or a lady-in-waiting, or a monk copying sutras in a temple above the city, would begin by pouring a small amount of water onto the stone from a little vessel called the sudeki, a water dropper often made of ceramic or bronze in the shape of a small animal, a turtle, a crouching frog, a rounded vessel no larger than a plum. Then, holding the ink stick lightly between the fingers, the person would begin to grind it against the wet stone in slow, circular motions, applying even pressure, watching the water turn gradually darker and darker until it reached the right density, a process that might take 5 or 10 quiet minutes. The smell that rose from this grinding was distinctive and faintly resinous. Sumi ink was made from the soot of pine or other wood, mixed with animal glue and pressed into a stick, and its scent as it dissolved in water was something between earth and smoke, cool and ancient and particular to itself. That smell, once encountered, is not easily forgotten. It opens something in the mind that is very close to readiness. The writing boxes made to hold all these tools together were called suzuri, and from the 10th century onward, they were made of lacquered wood decorated with the same care given to a painting or a poem. Their surfaces were inlaid with mother-of-pearl, painted with autumn grasses or flying plovers, or sprinkled with gold dust in a technique called maki, a kind of sprinkled picture in which fine metal dust was applied to wet lacquer and then sealed beneath further layers, so that the decoration seemed to float deep within the surface rather than sitting on top of it. A beautiful writing box was itself a form of statement, displayed as a possession of significance, given as gifts between households, and mentioned in diaries and records as an indication of a family's taste. Some of the finest surviving examples are decorated with scenes from nature that match the season in which the box was to be used. A box intended for autumn correspondence might show scattered maple leaves across black lacquer, so that even the act of lifting its lid was a small ceremony of seasonal awareness. In a particularly beautiful detail preserved in the records of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, on the 7th day of the 7th month, the festival day of the weaving star and the herdsman star, the lovers separated by the river of the Milky Way, courtiers performed the ritual cleaning of their inkstones. Suzuri Arai, the washing of the Inkstone. The stone was taken from its box, rinsed carefully with clean water, dried and replaced. It was a small ceremony, lasting only minutes, but it acknowledged in the most direct way possible the importance of these objects in the life of the household, as if the stone itself deserved gratitude for what it made possible, as if it were a participant in the life of the household rather than merely a tool within it. The writing that emerged from Heian inkstones was not uniform in style. 3 principal scripts were practiced by educated people of the court. Kaisho, the block style, was clear and structured, each character given its full form, used for formal documents and texts requiring a quality of permanence. Jyosho, the semi-cursive running hand, was fluid and slightly rounded, moving between precision and ease, suited to letters and everyday correspondence. And Sosho, the grass hand, was a highly cursive style that approached the condition of pure gesture, where the forms of characters were suggested rather than stated, and the brushstroke itself became the primary carrier of meaning and feeling. The distinctly Japanese calligraphic style called Weo, the Japanese manner, emerged during the Middle Heian period as the court developed its own aesthetic independent of Chinese models. 3 calligraphers are remembered as the founders of this tradition: Ono no Michikaze, Fujiwara no Tsukimasa, and Fujiwara no Yukinari, together called the Sanseki, the 3 traces, whose work in the 10th century established the flowing, luminous quality of Japanese kana calligraphy. Before them, in the early Heian period, 3 other calligraphers had been celebrated as the supreme masters of their age: the monk Kyukai, Emperor Saga, and the courtier Takebana no Heianari, together known as the Sanpitsu, the 3 brushes. Stories about Kyukai's skill verge on legend. He was said to be able to write simultaneously with a brush in each hand and each foot, and sometimes one held in his mouth as well. This story expresses something real: the idea that the greatest calligraphers moved beyond individual effort and became conduits for something larger, the way a fast-flowing stream stops looking like individual movements of water and becomes simply a continuous, effortless thing. The invention of the kana syllabary itself, the distinctly Japanese writing system that emerged during the Heian period from the simplification and cursivization of Chinese characters, was one of the most transformative developments in the history of Japanese culture. Hiragana, the rounder and more fluid of the 2 kana systems, grew in large part from the hands of court ladies, who wrote in a style freer and more personal than the formal Chinese script still used by men in official contexts. Each hiragana character descended from a full Chinese character, but was worn smooth by the pressure of use, the way a river stone is worn smooth not by any single passage of water, but by the accumulated patience of many thousands of passages, until only the essential curve remains. The result was a script of extraordinary elegance, each character a gesture, a breath-given form, the whole syllabary together a kind of visual music that moved across the paper the way a melody moves through air. In the kana calligraphy practiced by the court ladies, each character was made of perhaps 2 or 3 brush strokes, curved, tapered, connected sometimes to the following character in a long continuous flow that resembled water moving over smooth stone. The speed of the brush, the angle at which it touched the paper, the amount of ink it carried, the precise moment of lifting, All of these produced effects considered as expressive of character as any content in the poem being written. The training required to produce truly beautiful calligraphy was not about force or technical control, so much as about becoming genuinely quiet inside. Quiet enough that the brush could move with the kind of unself-conscious flow that calligraphers then and now describe as the moment when technique dissolves and something more essential takes over. A saying preserved across centuries captures this exactly. Jai wa hido nari, the character is the person. The brushstroke does not represent you. In the deepest practice, it is you. In the Heian court, readiness for writing meant readiness for poetry, because writing and poetry were, in the deepest sense, the same activity. The Waka, a short poem of 5 lines running in the syllable pattern of 5, 7, 5, 7, 7, was not considered a special talent reserved for the gifted few, but a basic social skill as expected as knowing how to bow with the right degree of inclination or arrange the layers of one's silk robes so that the graduating colors at the sleeve harmonized with the season. The Waka was the primary medium of all intimate communication. When a courtier wished to speak of something that mattered, whether love, grief, admiration, the passage of a season, or the way the moon had looked the previous night over the fish pond, the form in which that feeling was transmitted was the poem. Correspondence between members of the court traveled almost entirely in this way. A short poem would be written on paper chosen carefully for its texture and color, perfumed with the incense that each household considered its private signature, folded in a way that itself communicated something about the sender's mood and aesthetic sensibility, tied with a sprig of whatever was seasonally appropriate. A plum branch in late winter, a spray of wisteria in early summer, a single red maple leaf in autumn, and sent by a messenger who might be watched from behind a screen for clues about how the poem had been received. The response would come in the form of another poem, and its quality, the precision of its imagery, the elegance of the handwriting, the appropriateness of the paper to the season, would be read as carefully as a spoken declaration and with as much consequence. What is remarkable about this mode of communication is not merely its beauty but its slowness, and the way that slowness was understood as a virtue rather than an inconvenience. Each step in the exchange, the grinding of the ink, the selection of paper, the composition of the poem, the wrapping and tying of the reply, the walk of the messenger through the corridor to the gate, was understood as part of the communication rather than merely its delivery mechanism. The time taken to make a poem beautiful was understood as the time taken to mean it fully. A carelessly written reply, dashed off on unsuitable paper, arrived already saying something about the sender's regard for the recipient. A poem written slowly, on paper whose color had been thought about, in a hand that showed genuine effort and genuine stillness. Such a poem arrived already carrying something of the quality of attention its sender had brought to it, the way a bowl made by a careful potter carries the memory of the hands that shaped it. Poetry gatherings called yudowace were formal events at which poets were divided into teams, and their poems judged by appointed arbiters. These events were taken with complete seriousness. The outcome of a poetry contest could enhance or diminish a courtier's reputation for years. Less formal poetry games were played for pure pleasure, one person offering the first 3 lines of a waka and another completing it, or one person citing the first line of a classical poem and the other racing to supply the remainder. Even the most spontaneous Waka was expected to show command of a deep tradition, the ability to make a subtle allusion to an earlier poem, to embed within apparently simple lines a reference that would reward recognition. The vast imperial anthology called the Kokken Wakashu, compiled in 905, gathered more than 1,100 poems in 20 volumes, and its preface, written by Kai no Tsuruyuki, contains one of the most beautiful descriptions of poetry's purpose in any language. Waka is the art, he writes, that takes for its seed the heart of humanity and grows into the 10,000 leaves of words. The gardens of the Heian estates were not decorative afterthoughts, but primary expressions of a household's inner life. The pond at the garden center was fed by a winding stream, the Yaramizu, that entered from the northeast, following the natural slope of the ground, and flowed beneath the connecting corridors before emptying into the pond through a course of shaped stones. This winding entry was itself meaningful. The Sakuteiki, the great text on garden-making written in the late Heian period, specifies that a stream should enter a garden from the north or east, where the mountains stand, where fresh water originates. The pond contained at least one island, Nakajima, the middle island, connected to the shore by arched lacquered bridges, whose curved forms were reflected in the dark water below. The red paint of those bridge railings would have been vivid against the green of summer plantings and against the white of winter snow, a deliberate color that announced itself without being harsh, like a single, well-chosen character in a poem that holds the whole meaning open. The garden's design followed principles described in that same Sakuteiki, whose pages speak of the need to listen to what the stones themselves wish to become, of the importance of understanding how water flows naturally before asking it to follow a designed path, of the relationship between the garden and the mountains visible beyond its boundary. The hills surrounding Heian-kyo were considered participants in the garden's composition, their wooded ridges and shifting light becoming part of the garden's total form. This concept of borrowed scenery, of inviting the landscape beyond the boundary into the aesthetic space within it, would become one of the defining ideas of Japanese garden making for all the centuries that followed, a principle so elegantly simple that it is still being discovered and applied in gardens around the world today. At the end of the southern corridors, the Tsurudono fishing pavilion extended over the water, and on evenings of ceremony or pleasure, small wooden boats were launched from there, carrying musicians whose instruments drifted their sound across the surface of the pond to where the court watched from the pavilions and the walkways. A music stage might be built out on the water for grand occasions, and the sound of the biwa lute and the show mouth organ would travel on the evening air across the whole garden, blending with the frogs and the wind in the garden pines. In the tale of Genji, Murasaki Shikibu describes such evenings with an intimacy that makes them feel immediately present. The way music sounds different over water than over land, fuller and more wavering, as if the pond were itself a kind of resonating chamber. The way a listener on the shore might hear the music growing fainter, and then suddenly, when the wind shifted, very close again, as if the sound itself were choosing its audience. There is a lovely detail in the Sakuteiki noting that the finest rock arrangements in these gardens were often placed at positions visible only from the water, so that the garden rewarded the person willing to move into it, to sit low in a boat and look up at the stones from below. There is something in this that resonates with the calligraphic idea that the work reveals itself to the person who approaches it in the right spirit, not from a position of mastery or demand, but of patient, unhurried reception. The gardens were planted with careful attention to seasonal change, because the seasons governed everything in Heian life. Their passage tracked not merely as a fact of weather, but as the primary material of feeling and art. Cherries and plums bloomed in spring, their flowers lasting their few famous days, and then falling in slow white and pink showers onto the pond's surface and the raked gravel of the courtyard. Lotus blossomed in the summer heat, their flowers rising from the dark water on thick stems, their broad leaves collecting the morning rain in round silver beads that trembled with the slightest movement of air. Chrysanthemums appeared in autumn, and beyond the garden walls, the maples of the surrounding hills turned the whole horizon red and amber as October settled into the valley. In winter, snow fell on the roof of the fishing pavilion, on the arched bridge, on the pine branches leaning over the water, and the water itself grew still and very dark, holding the pale sky and a faint reflection of everything that stood above it. The court followed an elaborate ceremonial calendar in which each month had its appropriate rituals, plants, colors, poems, and music. There was the ceremony of kakazone, the first writing of the new year, observed on the second day of the first month, in which the first brushstrokes of the year were made with special care and intention, the whole court taking up their brushes in something approaching a collective meditation. This tradition, which traces directly back to the Heian aristocracy, continues in Japan today. The same quality of beginning, the same acknowledgement that how you start a thing carries meaning, the same slow, careful first stroke of the brush on clean paper in the cold morning of a new year. There were moon-viewing parties in autumn, when the court gathered on the fishing pavilion to compose poems by the light of the harvest moon, the reflections of the sky trembling in the dark water below. There were cherry blossom processions in spring, boat excursions in summer, maple viewing expeditions to the nearby hills where the mountainsides went red as autumn deepened. One of the most refined of all Heian practices was the blending of incense, an art connected at its roots to the same aesthetic world as calligraphy and garden design. Every aristocratic family maintained its own incense formula, a blend of aromatic resins, sandalwood, cloves, camphor, and other ingredients combined in proportions kept as carefully as the formulas for lacquer or dye. The preparation was done with the same measured attention as the preparation of ink, small quantities of each ingredient ground and mixed. The process, a form of concentration that engaged the whole person in service of a very precise end. The finished blends were stored in ceramic jars, and when burned on small mica plates suspended over glowing charcoal, they released a smoke whose character was considered as personal and as identifying as a style of handwriting. To encounter someone's particular incense in a room they had recently left was understood as a form of their presence, an encounter with something essentially that person, still lingering in the air. Waka poetry and incense were understood as deeply related arts. Certain fragrances were composed to evoke particular seasons or emotional states, and at some poetry gatherings, the incense burned in the room was chosen to match the subject of the poems being composed. The smell of the room was part of the poem's context. It created a sensory ground from which the poem grew, the way soil creates the conditions for a particular kind of plant. The aristocrats who were considered most refined could identify an unfamiliar blend by scent alone, could name its ingredients, could detect when it had been aged or freshly made. This accomplishment, essentially a form of deep sensory attention, was valued as highly as any verbal skill because it represented the same underlying quality, the willingness to slow down enough to receive what is actually present, rather than moving through the world at a pace that makes only the obvious available. The women of the Heian court were among the most significant creators of this entire cultural world. Formally educated in calligraphy, music, and literature, confined for much of their days to the private quarters of the estate, they occupied a position that was simultaneously constrained and creatively prolific. It was the women of the court who brought the new kana script, the flowing, curved Japanese syllabary that emerged in the Heian period, to its fullest literary expression. Where the men of the court were expected to write official documents and formal poetry in Chinese, the women wrote in their own language, in the new script that moved across the paper like the motion of water, its characters built from curved strokes that could be joined into long, continuous lines, suggesting the natural flow of thought and feeling. Say Shonagon, a lady-in-waiting to Empress Teishi, kept a notebook she called the Pillow Book in the years around the turn of the first millennium, filling it with observations, lists, and impressions so vivid and immediate that reading it now feels like finding a room that was only just vacated. A room where the lamp is still warm and someone has left a poem half-finished on the writing table. She records things she finds beautiful. The way smoke rises from a fire on a cold night, the first snow on a garden that is familiar in all its summer greenness and appears transformed, the sound of rain on leaves. She records conversations overheard, poems exchanged, moments when something struck her as exactly right and moments when something fell short of what it could have been. Her writing has the quality of the best calligraphy. It looks effortless because all the effort has been absorbed into the work, and what remains is simply perception, simply the honest movement of attention across the surface of a life. She also gives, at one point in the Pillow Book, a list of things that make the heart feel cleaner, things that have, as she puts it, a quick, sharp quality. Among them, she includes the feeling of freshly written characters on smooth paper. Not the sight of them, not the meaning of them, but the physical experience of having made them, the slight resistance of the paper, the soft drag of the brush, the small damp sound as ink met fiber. This is someone describing the sensation of calligraphy from the inside. And what she is describing is not art production, but a quality of aliveness, a direct sensory encounter with the world, conducted through the mediation of the most refined tools human beings had devised for the purpose. Murasaki Shikibu, serving at almost exactly the same time as Sei Shonagon. The two women apparently did not admire each other, though they worked within the same small world, was writing what many scholars now consider the first novel in world literature, the tale of Genji, completed around the year 1008. 54 chapters, more than 800 embedded Waka poems, and a cast of characters so fully realized in their psychology that readers across 1,000 years have found them as recognizable as people they know. The novel contains the sound of music on the night air and the smell of carefully blended incense that each character wears as a personal signature, the rustle of layered silk as someone moves behind a screen, the quality of moonlight in different seasons, and how it falls differently on a person's face depending on what they are feeling. The scholar Matori Norinaga, writing in the 18th century, found in the Genji the purest expression of man no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, and his reading has never been surpassed. On the hillsides beyond the city, Buddhist temples had been established since the beginning of the Heian period, and their relationship to calligraphy carried a dimension of devotion that deepened everything connected to the inkstone and the brush. The copying of Buddhist sutras was understood as a religious act, accumulating merit for the copyist and for whoever the copying was done in honor of. Monks who undertook sutra copying prepared themselves with fasting and ritual cleansing, and the act of grinding ink and setting up the writing materials was understood as continuous with the spiritual preparation of the body and mind. The calligraphy produced in this context was expected to be beautiful not as an aesthetic end in itself, but as an expression of sincere devotion. Beautiful because beauty in this tradition was not separate from truth, because the effort to make each stroke as perfectly as it could be made was itself a form of prayer, a form of love offered to whatever the monk held sacred. The Shingon Buddhism brought to Japan by Kyukai at the beginning of the Heian period was particularly hospitable to this understanding. Shingon emphasized the use of sacred images, elaborate ritual, and the creation of mandalas, visual representations of the cosmos in which every element carried symbolic significance. The aesthetic of Shingon practice was one of ordered, luminous precision, in which the creation of beautiful things was understood as a form of devotion that could transmit the teachings not through words alone, but through the direct impact of visual and sensory beauty on the perceiving mind. This is a way of thinking about art that cuts very deep and connects, across centuries and cultures, to something that serious artists in any tradition have recognized: that the work, when it succeeds, does something to the person who encounters it that cannot be done any other way. The inkstone in the hands of the monk grinding his ink for sutra copying was therefore not a very different instrument from the inkstone in the hands of the courtier, preparing to write a love poem. Both were attempting the same thing: to be present enough, quiet enough, still enough, that what needed to be expressed could find its form. The papermakers who worked by the streams descending from the mountain slopes above the city were the quiet foundation of all this literary and devotional life. Washi paper was made from the inner bark of the paper mulberry tree, kozo, which was stripped in autumn after the harvest, soaked and boiled and beaten until the fibers separated into a smooth suspension in water, then lifted on fine bamboo screens and pressed into thin, flexible sheets that were dried in the winter air on smooth wooden boards. The quality of this paper, its weight, its texture, the particular way it accepted ink without bleeding too broadly or holding too rigidly, was a matter of the greatest attention. Paper makers in different regions developed distinctive styles, and certain papers acquired reputations that made them sought after by the calligraphers and court ladies of the capital. The washi accepted ink with a kind of quiet responsiveness, the way a good conversation partner accepts what is offered and gives something back, neither swallowing the words nor deflecting them, but holding them, releasing them, letting them be precisely what they were. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics that belongs particularly to the Heian period, though its influence extends in every direction from there. The concept called ma, the awareness of space and interval, of the gap between things and the significance carried in that gap. In calligraphy, ma refers to the space between characters and between strokes, the pauses in the brushwork that give each mark its breathing room and its weight. In music, ma is the silence between notes that gives the notes their meaning. In garden design, it is the open water of the pond between the islands, the empty gravel of the courtyard between the trees, the space of sky visible above the garden wall. In poetry, it is the pause between images, the moment when one thing is set down and another not yet named, the space in which the reader's own imagination enters and completes the poem. Without ma, the art is dense and airless. With it, there is room for the perceiving mind to participate, to bring something of its own, to feel that the work was made partly for and partly by the person encountering it. The aesthetic concept most associated with the Heian period, mono no aware, is related to ma in this way. It is an awareness of the interval between having something and losing it, between the beauty of a thing and its inevitable passing. The cherry blossoms falling, the summer ending, the lamp going out. These things are beautiful not despite their impermanence but because of it, because the awareness of their passing is itself a form of love. The courtiers of Heian-kyo were extraordinarily practiced in this awareness. It ran through their poetry, and their daily lives the way the Yaramizu stream ran through their gardens, not as a mournful undertone, but as the ground note of a whole way of being alive. To feel mono, no aware fully, was considered a mark of the deepest refinement. A person who could not feel it was considered somehow untranslatable in the world, unable to receive what the world was offering. And the literature produced from this sensibility has the quality of water that has been filtered through very fine stone, perfectly clear and very deep, and always in motion. By the time the 11th century had settled into its middle decades, the cultural achievement of Heian-kyo had reached something like its fullest expression. The literature being written in this period, Genji, the Pillow Book, and the great wave of court diaries and poetry anthologies, would not be surpassed and has never been forgotten. The gardens were tended with the same attention given to calligraphy. The writing boxes were lacquered with images that matched the poems written inside them. The incense burned was chosen for its resonance with the season and the hour. The brushwork of the calligraphers had reached a refinement that later centuries would study and attempt to recover. All of this had grown from the first movement of ink on stone, from those slow circular grindings in the lamplight, from the smell of pine soot dissolving in water, from the decision, made again each morning by thousands of people in this one valley surrounded by its mountains, that beauty and attention were the primary business of being alive. There is a ritual still observed in Japan today that carries the direct memory of Heian calligraphic practice. On the second day of the new year, in schools and households across the country, the first writing of the year is undertaken in the tradition called kakazon. A brush is taken up, ink is ground or prepared, and the first characters of the new year are made with full intention and quiet focus. A small ceremony of beginning, acknowledging that the year is fresh and that how you begin a thing carries meaning. The tradition traces directly back to the aristocratic custom of the Heian court, where the second day of the first month was set aside for exactly this practice. The whole court taking up their brushes, in something approaching a collective meditation on what they were doing with their hours and their words. The act has changed over 1,000 years, spread to every household in Japan, but its inner quality remains the same. An understanding that the movement of the brush is a form of presence, that writing is a form of attention, that attention is a form of love for whatever is being attended to. The mountains above Heian-kyo held their long patience, as they do still. The cryptomeria forests of Higashiyama, the springs on Kijiyama, the slopes where in certain years the first snow fell before the maples had finished their color. All of this was there then as it is there now, the landscape persisting long after every individual life that moved through it has gone. The courtiers who took boat trips on the garden pond in autumn, composing their harvest moon poems by lamplight, are gone. The women who sat behind their bamboo blinds grinding ink and composing the words that became the first great novel in world literature are gone. The monks on their hillsides copying sutras by candlelight, the craftsmen pressing washi paper by the mountain streams, the gardeners who placed each stone beside the Yarimizu with such care that it appeared inevitable, all of them gone. But what they left behind is not nothing. It is, if anything, richer for the passage of time, deeper for having been carried so long, worn smooth like a stone in a river, until only what is essential remains. 1,000-year-old Inkstone, if it had survived, would be perfectly usable today. You could pour water onto its surface, take up an ink stick, and begin the same slow grinding motion that began every act of calligraphy in Heian-kyo, and the smell that rose from the stone would be the same smell, pine soot in water, something between smoke and earth, that rose from that same motion 1,000 years ago. This is one of the quieter miracles of material culture, that certain tools remain so precisely fitted to their purpose that time cannot improve them and sees no reason to change them. The stone endures. The smell endures. The quality of attention required to use the stone well endures. What the stone requires of us has not changed. Only patience, only care, only the willingness to slow down until the ink is ready and the mind is ready and the hand is ready, and then to begin. And so we arrive at the end of our long, quiet journey through this ancient and extraordinary city, a city of lamplight and garden ponds, of lacquered writing boxes and paper as soft as cloth, of poems written in the dark and sent across a courtyard by messenger, of monks on hillsides grinding their ink by candlelight and courtiers in layered silk composing verses to the moon. The city of Heian-kyo would endure as the imperial capital for more than 1,000 years, through fires and reconstructions, through the rise and fall of clans, and the arrival of entirely new ways of living. But this particular world, the world of the Heian period at its height, in those remarkable centuries when beauty was itself a kind of governance and calligraphy, was the primary measure of a person's inner life. This world was singular, and its light was soft, and it left behind an art and a literature, and a way of paying attention to the natural world that have not yet been exhausted by all the centuries of returning to them. The inkstone sits cool in its lacquered box. The water dropper holds the last of the evening's water. On the paper, the ink is long since dry, the characters standing quietly in their rows, each one a small perfection, each one carrying the memory of the hand that made it. Outside, the mountain called Higashiyama holds the dark against the sky, as it has held it for centuries beyond counting. The garden is very still. Somewhere in the pond, something moves, just barely, and the lantern light on the surface trembles once and settles again into its long reflection. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us at the Bedtime Lore. Rest well now and let these ancient echoes, the soft sound of ink being ground, the lap of water against a lacquered bridge, the first careful stroke of a brush on a new morning's paper, carry you gently into dreams.